Hey guys, tonight we're officially ditching the glittering castles, the valiant knights, and frankly anything that smells remotely like a rose garden. Because, let's be brutally honest, that's not where most people lived, fought, or generally tried not to die during the Middle Ages. Instead, we're strapping on our metaphorical, perpetually mud-caked boots and trudging, with a sigh, into the far less glamorous, deeply uncomfortable, and often utterly miserable reality of what it truly meant to simply survive as a medieval peasant. This isn't a fairy tale with a happy ending, unless not starving to death this winter counts as a happy ending, which, for many, it absolutely did. So, before you get too cozy in your climate-controlled, pest-free, lit home luxuries that would have brought a medieval peasant to tears, perhaps consider hitting that like button and subscribing, but only if you're genuinely ready to confront the unvarnished, unsanitized truth of medieval existence. No judgment if you prefer your history with more dragons and less dysentery. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to think about who's joining us from across the globe, from their own very different realities. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn off the central heating for a bit to get into the authentic, bone-chilling mood, just kidding mostly, but seriously, feel the chill, and let's ease into tonight's truly harsh journey together. Imagine waking up, not to the gentle chirping of your phone alarm, or even a digital clock showing the precise time, but to the insistent, often violent crow of a rooster that sounds like it's personally judging every single one of your life choices since birth. Or perhaps it's the insistent bleating of a goat, or the snort of a pig right outside, or inside your bedroom. You're not in a comfy, memory foam-topped bed, not even a simple wooden frame. No, you're likely on a straw-filled pallet, a thin layer between you and the hard, cold earth floor. This pallet is probably shared with several family members, possibly a few clucking chickens who wandered in for warmth, and definitely a thriving, multi-generational ecosystem of fleas, lice, and whatever other tiny itchy companions found your body heat irresistible. This, my friends, is your medieval alarm clock, signaling the start of another day where survival isn't a long-term goal, it's the only option. We're talking 12th century Europe, maybe 14th century, where life is dictated entirely by the sun, the unforgiving seasons, and the often capricious whims of a lord who owns the very patch of dirt you live and breathe on. Your village is a cluster of crudely built wattle and daub huts. Think mud and sticks, baked hard by the sun, maybe with a small drafty church and a communal mill, the only piece of sophisticated machinery for miles. The air? A rich, earthy, deeply unperfumed blend of wood smoke curling from inefficient hearths, damp earth, unwashed bodies, we'll get to that, and the persistent, pervasive aroma of farm animals. Welcome to the daily grind, where luxury is an abstract dream, and basic comfort is a myth whispered in lullabies. Your body, if you're lucky enough to have defied the terrifying odds and made it past the gauntlet of childhood diseases, is a testament to constant, unyielding toil. From the first grey light of dawn until the utter blackness of night, your life is an unbroken chain of physical labour. Imagine waking before the sun even thinks about rising, your muscles already screaming and aching from yesterday's relentless efforts, only to begin another day of back-breaking, repetitive work in the fields. There are no powerful, diesel-guzzling tractors, no sophisticated, precision-engineered tools, just human and animal power, raw, unyielding, and desperately slow. You're out there, likely behind a pair of slow, stubborn oxen, wrestling a heavy wooden plough through stubborn earth that has seen generations of your family do exactly the same. You're sowing seeds by hand, meticulously, painstakingly, praying to every saint in the calendar that the weather holds, because one bad harvest doesn't just mean a poor quarter, it means starvation, plain and simple. Not just a sad emoji on a social media post, but the actual, gnawing, gut-wrenching kind of hunger that steals the life from your children. Then there's weeding, an endless, monotonous task under the scorching sun. Harvesting, a race against the elements, cutting grain with a sickle until your fingers are raw and bleeding. Threshing, beating the grain from the stalks, a cloud of dust and chaff filling your lungs. These are endless, repetitive tasks, performed under the merciless sun or in biting, miserable rain. And when you're not in the fields, you're gathering firewood, mending fences that always seem to be collapsing, fetching water from the communal well, a surprisingly heavy and time-consuming chore, or tending to the livestock that represent your family's entire precarious wealth. Rest? That's a concept for nobles lounging in tapestried halls, or perhaps for the truly fortunate dead. For you, rest means falling into an exhausted stupor after dark, only to do it all over again the very next day. It's not a job, it's a life sentence of manual labour, handed down through generations, with very little chance of parole. And what, pray tell, fuels this endless, demanding work? Food, of course. But dear listener, forget your sophisticated modern notion of a balanced, varied diet, or even a particularly tasty one. A medieval peasant's meal plan was less farm-to-table gourmet, and more gruel to gruel if you're lucky. Your staple diet consists almost entirely of pottage, a thick, often incredibly bland stew made primarily from whatever grains you could grow, like oats, barley or rye. Root vegetables might make an appearance if you're particularly lucky and the harvest was good, along with whatever wild herbs you could cautiously forage from the local woods. Bread, usually a dense, coarse loaf made from the cheapest, heaviest grains, is a precious commodity. It's often stale, hard enough to knock out a horse, and definitely not artisanal. Meat? Ah, meat. That's a rare, almost mythical treat, perhaps glimpsed on a major feast day, or if you manage to catch a small wild animal, and crucially, avoided your lord's inevitable violent wrath for poaching on his land. Dairy products like cheese and butter are available, but often in limited quantities, especially through the lean winter months. Fresh fruit and vegetables are strictly seasonal, meaning for much of the year, your diet is incredibly monotonous, lacking in essential vitamins and minerals. Scurvy was basically a rite of passage, not a rare exotic disease. This constant caloric deficit means chronic fatigue, a weakened immune system, and an almost perpetual susceptibility to illness. Every meal, a grey, lukewarm reminder of your place in the rigid social hierarchy, a testament to what you don't have. It's not dining, it's merely fuel, pure and unadorned, just enough to keep the engine of labour running, barely. Home sweet home? For a medieval peasant, that meant a cramped, often single-room hut, probably built from rough local materials like wattle and daub, basically woven branches plastered with mud and dung, delightful with a thatched roof that, let's be honest, frequently leaked during a good downpour. Imagine a space no larger than your average modern living room, housing an entire family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and sometimes even a distant aunt. Privacy, that's not just a luxury, it's a concept for the distant, unimaginable future. Your bedroom is a pile of straw on the floor, offering some meager insulation from the cold earth. And, as we mentioned, a highly effective breeding ground for fleas, bedbugs, and other delightful little creatures. The hearth, a simple stone circle in the centre of the room, provides warmth and a place to cook, but also fills the entire space with acrid, stinging smoke, leaving you constantly coughing, your eyes streaming, and your lungs slowly accumulating grime. This isn't just unpleasant, it causes serious, long-term respiratory problems. And remember those animals we talked about? They're often sharing your living space, especially during harsh winters, for mutual warmth and security. So, the smell of wood smoke is competing valiantly with the pervasive aroma of livestock, damp earth, and, let's be blunt, unwashed human bodies. Bathing is a rare, cherished luxury, often only undertaken in public bathhouses in larger towns, if you were lucky enough to visit one and afford the cost, or a quick freezing dip in a nearby river. Forget deodorant, perfume, or even clean linens. Those weren't invented yet, or were strictly for the elite. Your clothes, typically coarse wool and linen, are worn until they literally fall apart, rarely washed, and repaired endlessly with crude stitches. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's a constant, never-ending battle against filth, parasites, and the general indignities of medieval personal hygiene. And speaking of indignities and a general lack of pleasantness, let's talk about medieval healthcare, or, more accurately, the distinct, terrifying lack thereof. Life is a delicate, precarious balance, and disease is an ever-present, terrifying spectre, like a monstrous landlord with a scythe. Imagine a world utterly devoid of antibiotics, antiseptics, or even a basic, rudimentary understanding of germ theory. A simple cut from a tool in the field could turn fatally septic in days. A common cold, to which you are constantly susceptible due to malnutrition, could escalate into pneumonia, swiftly stealing your breath. Childbirth, often a joyful event in stories, was in reality a terrifying gamble, often a death sentence for both mother and child. Infant mortality rates were shockingly, heartbreakingly high, with many children not even making it past their first birthday. Diseases like dysentery, perpetual stomach issues, lovely, smallpox, measles, and of course the ever-present, utterly devastating threat of the plague could sweep through a village, wiping out entire families in a matter of days, leaving behind only grief and fear. Your local doctor might be the village wise woman, dispensing herbal remedies and old wives' tales, some occasionally effective, most not. Or perhaps a barber surgeon whose skills, largely specialised in bloodletting, draining bad blood from your body, often making things worse and crude, agonising amputations, performed with unsterilised tools and plenty of agonising screams. Medical knowledge is largely based on ancient theories of humours, imbalances in bodily fluids, and superstition often plays as large a role as any practical treatment. There's no escaping the constant nagging fear of illness. No quick fix, no magic pill. Just the grim reality that your body is constantly battling against unseen, overwhelming enemies. To survive past middle age is less a testament to good health, and more to sheer, blind, unadulterated luck, a roll of the cosmic dice against overwhelming odds. Your place in society? Rigid, immutable, and about as comfortable as wearing a sackcloth tunic in the middle of a July heatwave. You are a peasant, a serf, essentially human chattel, tied inextricably to the land you work. Forget social mobility, that's not just a pipe dream, it's a concept that hasn't even been invented yet, a luxury for later centuries. Your entire life is dictated by a feudal system where you owe labour, taxes often in kind, meaning a significant portion, sometimes even a third or more of your painstakingly grown crops and unwavering loyalty to your lord. You can't just pack up your metaphorical onion and leave the land without his express, usually withheld, permission. You can't marry without his consent. And every aspect of your meager existence is under his ultimate, unchallenged control. He provides protection, theoretically often only from other lords, and in return he owns you, metaphorically speaking, but often literally as well. Your complaints are unheard, your individual voice a tiny whisper against the roar of his power. Justice, if you're lucky enough to even get it, is dispensed by the Lord's court, often arbitrary, always biased, and almost invariably favouring the powerful. This isn't just about poverty, it's about a complete lack of agency, a life lived under constant supervision, oppression, and the heavy boot of authority. Your dreams are small, practical, enough food to last the winter, good health for your children, and perhaps, just perhaps, avoiding the Lord's wrath for another day. It's a system designed to keep you down, and it was remarkably effective. But even amidst this relentless, soul-crushing hardship, life, with its stubborn, tenacious will, found a way to squeeze out small, precious moments of joy. Forget Netflix and chill. Medieval entertainment was far more communal, immediate, and frankly, a lot more work. Storytellers, those wandering troubadours of truth and fiction, might wander into the village, spinning tales of distant lands, brave knights, the kind you only dream of, not the ones trampling your crops, and mythical beasts, transporting you, if only for an hour or two, from your grueling reality. Music, played on simple flutes, drums, or crude stringed instruments, would fill the air, prompting communal dancing and singing, a rare chance to move your body for pleasure, not just necessity. Children, despite the terrifyingly high mortality rates that would horrify us today, still found ways to play, mimicking adult chores with sticks and stones, or engaging in simple, timeless games. These were not grand, sophisticated amusements, but vital communal gatherings, precious moments of shared humanity that allowed a brief escape from the harsh reality. A reminder that even in the toughest, most impoverished lives, there was a spark of joy, a shared laugh, a moment of profound, comforting connection. These small joys were less about escaping reality and more about enduring it. And yet, my friends, the shadows deepen, because beyond the relentless labour, the thin gruel, and the constant fear of disease, there were other, equally terrifying shadows looming large, ready to snatch away what little security, what little peace you might have managed to build through sheer, unadulterated grit. These weren't just the unpredictable whims of nature, the bad harvest or the sudden plague. No, these were the sharp, unforgiving teeth of human conflict and the invisible, yet crushing, weight of an authority that could be both arbitrary and brutal. First, imagine living under the constant, nagging, stomach-churning threat of violence. You might not be a knight, a soldier, or a noble, but you are almost invariably the first casualty in a lord's petty squabble, or the easy target for a band of out-of-work mercenaries. When rival lords decided to have a disagreement, perhaps over a disputed patch of land, or a perceived insult, it wasn't a gentlemanly duel in a picturesque arena, it was a brutal, indiscriminate free-for-all across your carefully tended fields and through your defenceless village. Soldiers, whether your own lord's men, who could be just as bad, marauding brigands looking for an easy score, or foreign invaders, saw peasants as little more than resources to be plundered, or worse, obstacles to be removed. Your painstakingly cultivated crops, trampled into the mud, fodder for horses. Your humble homes, looted of their meager possessions, and often casually burned to the ground for no reason other than spite or convenience. Women and children, horrifyingly vulnerable to the worst kinds of abuses. There was no 911 to call, no National Guard, no international peacekeepers, just the terrifying, immediate reality of being caught between armed men who cared little for your meager existence. Staying hidden in the woods, praying you weren't noticed, or simply enduring the devastation with a stoic broken heart was your only strategy. It was like living in a constant state of low-level anarchy, where the biggest risk wasn't just starvation or disease, but the very real chance of losing everything, your home, your family, your life, to a sword or a torch, because two powerful men couldn't get along. Then there's the relentless, invisible, yet utterly pervasive hand of the Lord, reaching deep into your pockets and taking its cut before you even saw your own. You see, being a peasant wasn't just about hard work. It was a complicated financial arrangement, almost exclusively in favour of everyone but you. You owed a bewildering array of feudal dues, often amounting to a significant portion, sometimes even a third or more, of your painstakingly grown crops. This wasn't a choice, not a negotiation. It was enforced by threat of violence or eviction. On top of that, you had to pay tithes to the all-powerful church, typically a tenth of everything you produced. And they meant everything: your precious wheat, the few eggs your chickens laid, the wool shorn from your sheep, even the honey from your humble bees. Imagine spending months tending your crops, only for the priest to show up and claim every 10th sheaf for God, even if your own children were hungry. Then your lord, never one to miss an opportunity, might demand tallage, an arbitrary tax that could be levied for any reason he deemed fit to fund his next petty war, to pay a ransom for himself, or simply because he wanted more wealth to throw a lavish feast. And don't forget the corvée labour, those mandatory days of free work you owed on the Lord's land, building his castles, mending his roads, or repairing his private fish pond, all while your own fields lay waiting, your own family suffered from your absence. This wasn't just taxation. It was a sophisticated, deeply entrenched system designed to keep you perpetually on the brink, constantly dependent, ensuring that just enough was left for you to survive and keep working, but never ever enough to truly get ahead. It was a financial treadmill where no matter how fast you ran, you never ever moved forward. It was a life lived in debt, both literal and metaphorical, to the very powerful forces that controlled your existence. And what about your mind in all this? Forget formal education, or even the basic ability to read and write. That was a rare luxury, strictly for monks, clergy, and the upper echelons of nobility, not for someone whose primary job was to coax enough food from the dirt to avoid starvation. For the vast majority of medieval peasants, literacy was practically non-existent. There were no public schools, no local libraries, and frankly, not much need for reading or writing when your world revolved entirely around the plough, the harvest, and the grinding cycle of agrarian life. Knowledge was passed down orally, through generations of practical experience, observation, and cautionary tales about what happens if you don't appease the local spirits. Your understanding of the wider world came from the occasional travelling merchant who passed through, a wandering friar preaching the word of God, or the ever-present, ever-vigilant village gossip. This meant your world was incredibly small, often confined to your village and its immediate surroundings, perhaps a day's walk to the nearest market town if you were lucky. Information was scarce, often distorted, and almost always filtered through the lens of superstition and fear. When things went wrong, a strange illness, a failed crop, a cow that suddenly stopped giving milk, it was often attributed to witchcraft, evil spirits, or divine displeasure, not science or logical cause and effect. This made communities vulnerable to manipulation, gossip, and resistant to new ideas, caught in a cycle of tradition and unexamined beliefs. Living without Google is one thing. Living without any books, or anyone who can reliably read them, is an entirely different, terrifying level of information or darkness. Your mind, like your body, was largely confined by the harsh realities of your existence. We've already trudged through the never-ending labour, chewed on the bland reality of pottage, shivered in a smoky hut, and dodged the invisible assassins of medieval disease. We've even peeked into the financial black hole that was feudal taxation. But believe it or not, there were more terrors waiting just outside the village palisade, beyond the Lord's demands and the priest's tithes. Tonight we're venturing into the truly wild side of peasant survival, the raw, untamed dangers of the natural world itself, and the omnipresent, bone-steep grip of superstition that filled every unexplained shadow. Because when your life is already a struggle, the last thing you need is a werewolf, or a flood, or a disgruntled fairy. So, steel yourselves. Before we dive into the murky depths of medieval fears, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're feeling brave enough to face the full spectrum of nature's wrath and humanity's oldest anxieties. Let me know where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there. Now, dim the lights, maybe light a candle for atmosphere and to ward off any lingering spirits, and let's ease into tonight's truly chilling journey together. Imagine for a moment stepping out of your flimsy wattle and daub hut. You're not just leaving your home, you're stepping into a world that is, frankly, actively trying to kill you. The medieval landscape, particularly beyond the immediate cultivated fields, was not the picturesque, gently rolling countryside we often romanticize today. It was a vast, untamed, and deeply hostile wilderness, bristling with dangers both seen and unseen. For a peasant, this wasn't a scenic backdrop, it was a deadly gauntlet. And at the top of that food chain, often surprisingly close to your village, were the genuine flesh-and-blood predators, wolves. These weren't cuddly storybook characters. These were lean, hungry hunters who saw your sheep, your goats, and sometimes even your isolated children or a solitary traveller as an easy meal. Imagine the constant, stomach-tightening fear of a wolf pack. Their distant howls weren't just background noise, they were a lullaby of terror, a reminder that your livestock needed constant guarding, and that venturing too far from the village, especially after dusk, was an invitation to disaster. Bears, though less common in some regions, were equally formidable, particularly if you stumbled upon one while foraging for berries or firewood. And then there were wild boars, notoriously aggressive, armed with razor-sharp tusks, capable of ripping open a human or a horse with terrifying speed. These were not animals to be trifled with. An encounter could mean crippling injury or death, with absolutely no medical recourse. Your only protection was a crude spear, a stout stick, or sheer desperate flight. The forest, far from being a tranquil haven, was a dark, dangerous place, a borderland between human survival and the raw, unfeeling savagery of nature. And if the tooth and claw dangers weren't enough, Mother Nature herself often seemed to conspire against you with a capricious and brutal fury that makes our modern weather reports look like a picnic forecast. Forget just a bad harvest. We're talking full-blown natural disasters that could wipe out everything you owned in a single, devastating blow. Imagine torrential rains that turned the gentle stream into a raging torrent, swelling into a monstrous flood that swept through your low-lying village, destroying your flimsy hut, drowning your precious livestock, and ruining the painstakingly planted fields. There was no FEMA, no emergency services. When the waters receded, you were left with nothing but mud, debris, and the daunting task of starting over if you were lucky enough to still be alive. Then there were the bone-chilling blizzards and extreme cold of winter. Your homes, as we've discussed, were barely insulated, heated by a single smoky hearth. Freezing to death was a very real, very common threat, especially for the elderly and the young. Animals, vital to your survival, would perish in the cold, their carcasses a grim reminder of your own vulnerability. A particularly long or harsh winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a mass extinction event for both humans and animals. And on the flip side, prolonged droughts could turn your fertile fields into cracked, dusty deserts. Parched crops meant no food. Dried up wells meant no water for drinking, washing, or even your few animals, exacerbating disease and hygiene issues. Your wattle and daub huts, with their dry thatched roofs, were tinderboxes. A spark from the hearth, a carelessly dropped torch, and an entire village could go up in flames in a matter of minutes, taking with it every possession, every scrap of food, and often many lives. This wasn't just inconvenient, this was absolute, total destruction, leaving you utterly destitute and alone, gazing at the smouldering ashes of your entire world. But beyond the tangible threats of wild beasts and brutal weather, there was another layer of terror, an invisible, yet omnipresent grip on the medieval peasant's psyche, the deep-seated, all-consuming fear of the supernatural. In a world utterly devoid of scientific explanation for disease, crop failure, or sudden death, the unknown was not just a blank space, it was actively populated by malevolent forces. The forest wasn't just home to wolves, it harboured local sprites, mischievous fairies, definitely not the sparkly, benevolent kind of today, and ancient, often angry, spirits. Every unexplained event, a cow going dry, a child falling ill, butter refusing to churn, could be attributed to witchcraft, the evil eye, or the sinister workings of a demon. Imagine the constant psychological burden of living in a world perceived as actively hostile, where every shadow held a potential threat, and every misfortune was a sign of unseen malicious intent. This wasn't just idle superstition, it profoundly impacted daily actions. Charms were worn, rituals performed before planting or harvesting, and certain places or times were strictly avoided. People lived in constant dread of offending these unseen powers, always seeking protection, whether through a blessing from the priest, a specific herb, or a carved talisman above their door. The church, of course, played a massive role here, offering solace but also reinforcing these fears by actively combating perceived spiritual threats, sometimes conflating them with natural ones. Blessed fields, minor exorcisms for possessed livestock, prayers against plagues. These were all desperate attempts to wield divine authority against a world that seemed to be actively working against you. So, you've somehow avoided being eaten by a wolf, outlasted the latest drought, and resisted the urge to blame your neighbour for your cow's mysterious ailment. The sheer physical vulnerability imposed by nature's fury, combined with the constant psychological weight of supernatural fears, painted a picture of a life lived perpetually on edge. This relentless struggle against a hostile environment, both physical and perceived, was just another layer in the exhausting, often brutal reality of surviving as a medieval peasant. And yet, somehow, they pushed on. We've dodged the wolf packs, cursed the relentless floods, and even tiptoed around the truly wild concept of supernatural malevolence haunting the forests. We've established that medieval peasant life wasn't just hard, it was a multi-layered existential challenge. But even amidst these grand, sweeping terrors, there was a microcosm of survival, a tiny, often fragile universe that was both your greatest strength and your most profound vulnerability, the peasant family. Tonight, we're peeling back the thatched roof of that cramped hut and looking at the intimate, often brutal dynamics of medieval family life and the gender roles that bound everyone to an inescapable, unending cycle of duty. Because in this era, a family wasn't just a group of people who loved each other, it was a survival unit, a small, grunting, perpetually tired corporation against a hostile world. So, before we dive into the unromanticized realities of medieval domesticity, perhaps consider giving a like and subscribing, only if you're truly ready to see how the other half, the 90%, lived, loved and laboured, of course. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to connect. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a comforting, non-gruel-based beverage, and let's ease into tonight's truly intimate journey together. Imagine a single, smoky room, barely bigger than your modern kitchen, holding not just you but your parents, your siblings, maybe an elderly grandparent and quite possibly a goat or some chickens. This isn't just your home, this is your entire world. The family unit, for a medieval peasant, was the absolute core of existence, the primary engine of labour. and the only real social security system you could ever hope for. There was immense, unyielding pressure to procreate, and to procreate often. Because infant mortality rates, as we've seen, were astronomically high. Many hands were literally required for survival, both to work the fields and to replace those lost to disease, famine, or accident. A large family wasn't a choice for personal fulfillment, it was a strategic necessity, a desperate gamble against the odds. Marriages often happened young, not for love in the romantic sense, but as an economic arrangement, a merging of labour and resources, frequently decided by parents with an eye on the next harvest. The wedding itself might have been a simple, hurried affair, followed by a lifetime of shared toil, and the quiet hope that enough children would survive to carry on the unending work. Each new mouth was a challenge, yes, but each new pair of tiny hands was also a future investment, a small, wailing promise against the terrifying void of tomorrow. And within this cramped, demanding household, the burden on women was immense, often beyond anything we can truly comprehend today. A medieval peasant woman's life was a relentless, multifaceted marathon of physical labour, both inside and outside the home. Childbirth, itself a terrifying, life-threatening ordeal, was a recurring event, often beginning in her late teens and continuing until menopause, each birth a roll of the dice for her own survival. But her duties didn't end with babies, they began with the son. Domestically, she was the master of 1,000 necessary chores, hauling heavy buckets of water from the communal well, cooking the ever-present pottage over an open, smoky fire, baking the coarse bread, mending worn-out clothes with endless patches, cleaning the single dirt-floored room, spinning wool or flax into thread, a deeply time-consuming process, and often tending a small kitchen garden. Food preservation, a matter of life and death, often fell to her, salting meat, drying herbs, preparing whatever could be stored for the long winter. Her day was a continuous cycle of physically demanding, repetitive tasks, often performed with little rest, little food, and absolutely no recognition. Her value was not in her career or her identity, but in her ceaseless, indispensable contribution to the family's sheer, day-to-day survival. She was the unsung, utterly exhausted engine of the peasant household. The men, of course, carried their own crushing weight of responsibility, often serving as the primary face of the family to the outside world, particularly to the formidable lord. His life was largely defined by the heavy, back-breaking labour of the fields, ploughing, sowing, harrowing, and harvesting, often from dawn until dusk, regardless of weather. His muscles were his most valuable tools, constantly used, constantly aching. Beyond the fields, he was responsible for the heaviest physical tasks, felling trees for firewood and building materials, maintaining the crude agricultural implements, repairing the hut, and leading the livestock. He was also theoretically the protector of his family, though, as we've discussed, his ability to protect against marauding soldiers or a capricious lord was often laughably limited, bordering on non-existent. He carried the psychological burden of ensuring the family met its feudal obligations, paying the lord's dues, performing corvée labour, and navigating the often treacherous relationship with authority figures. Failure to provide, to meet his obligations, or to simply endure meant not just personal hardship, but the potential ruin and starvation of his entire family. His identity, his worth, was inextricably tied to his physical strength, his endurance, and his ability to wrestle a meager living from the land. Children in this world were not granted the extended, protected childhood we recognize today. From their earliest years, perhaps as young as 5 or 6, they were initiated into the relentless cycle of labour. Playtime was brief, utilitarian, and often mimicked adult chores. Younger children might be tasked with guarding the sheep, scaring birds from the crops, fetching small items, or looking after even younger siblings. As they grew, their responsibilities escalated, quickly moving into full-time farm labour, their small hands and growing bodies contributing directly to the family's survival. A child was a vital, if vulnerable, part of the labour force, not just a cherished individual. Education, as we know it, was simply not a factor. Their learning was practical, hands-on, passed down through observation and participation, how to plant, how to harvest, how to care for animals, how to mend, how to forage. It was an apprenticeship in survival, served from dawn until dusk. This early integration into labour meant a childhood cut brutally short, full of hard work and constant exposure to the dangers of the medieval world. with that ever-present terrifying risk of disease or accident claiming them before they even reached adulthood. And then there were the elderly. If you were fortunate enough to survive to old age, and that was a huge if, given the average life expectancy, your role within the family shifted. Respected for their accumulated wisdom and experience, particularly in farming lore and folk remedies, they were also a potential burden if their physical strength waned too much. While they might still contribute with lighter tasks like spinning, mending, or minding children, their declining ability to perform heavy labour could strain the family's already precarious resources. There was no state pension, no retirement home. Care for the elderly fell entirely to the family. This could be a profound challenge in a household already struggling to feed itself. The harsh reality was that survival often meant prioritising the able-bodied, those who could actively contribute to the relentless grind. It paints a picture of a life cycle where utility often outweighed sentimentality, a cold truth forced by the unforgiving realities of subsistence. This leads us to a crucial point, the notion of sentimentality versus practicality. While love and affection undoubtedly existed within medieval peasant families, humans are, after all, hardwired for connection, the sheer, overwhelming struggle for survival often meant that practicality trumped overt emotional expression, at least by modern standards. The loss of a child was heartbreaking, but it was also, grimly, a common occurrence, absorbed into the harsh rhythm of life. Animals were valuable assets, not just pets. Every decision, from marriage to the number of children to how resources were allocated, was viewed through the lens of survival. It wasn't that they didn't care, it's that they couldn't afford not to be relentlessly practical. In essence, the peasant family was the micro-society of survival, a tiny, often exhausted crew navigating the tempestuous seas of medieval existence. Every member, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had a defined, indispensable role, and the failure of one could threaten the very existence of all. It was a constant, intimate struggle against disease, hunger, and oppression, bound together by necessity, tradition, and the quiet, enduring hope of simply seeing another sunrise. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes our own family squabbles seem rather tame in comparison. We've weathered the physical storms, the feudal demands, and the soul-crushing family responsibilities. We've even given a nod to the ever-present spectre of the supernatural, but there's one colossal, omnipresent institution we've only grazed, one that simultaneously offered immense solace and exerted crushing control: the medieval church. It was far more than just a building where you went on Sundays. It was the very framework of existence, the operating system for your entire life, and often another heavy hand reaching into your meager pockets. So, before you light another candle for the saints, or, just to see what you're doing, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only if you're prepared to dive into the truly complex, often contradictory, relationship between faith and hardship. Let me know where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there. Now, dim the lights, perhaps hum a Gregorian chant, or don't, I won't judge, and let's ease into tonight's journey into the spiritual and practical realities of medieval life. Imagine, for a moment, the vast, echoing interior of your village church. It might be the grandest stone structure in your entire world, built with the sweat and tithes of generations of peasants like you. For all the ceaseless toil and relentless hardship, the church offered the one thing that truly mattered: hope. Hope for salvation, hope for eternal life, hope that this brutal short existence was merely a prelude to something infinitely better. The priest, often the only literate person for miles, was more than a spiritual guide. He was the local authority on morals, the source of news, however skewed, and perhaps the only person who offered a shred of comfort in times of plague or famine. The sacraments. Baptism, confession, communion, last rites marked the milestones of your life, providing a sense of order and meaning in a chaotic world. Community gatherings, religious festivals, and feast days, often tied to saints' days, provided crucial breaks from labour, offering collective celebration and shared belief. The Church's teachings, however strict, gave structure to your world, explained the inexplicable, often by blaming sin, and offered a promise of justice, if not in this life, then certainly in the next. It was the great equalizer, a beacon of light in an otherwise oppressive darkness, the spiritual glue that held entire communities together. But like any powerful institution, the church was a double-edged sword, offering salvation with one hand and demanding obedience, and a hefty price with the other. Those tithes we mentioned, a tenth of everything you produced, religiously enforced, year after year, no matter how bad the harvest. This wasn't a voluntary donation, it was a non-negotiable tax, backed by the spiritual threat of excommunication and the very real threat of earthly punishment. Imagine barely scraping by, your children hungry, and still having to hand over a portion of your precious grain to the local priest, knowing it would likely go to support a distant bishop or an opulent cathedral, far removed from your struggle. Beyond the tithes, there were fees for every sacrament, baptism, marriage, burial. Even dying cost money. The church, for all its spiritual guidance, was also a massive, wealthy, landowning corporation, a major feudal power in its own right, extracting wealth from the very people it promised to save. Its rigid doctrines policed every aspect of your life, from whom you could marry to what you could eat on certain days. Breaking those rules risked not just earthly penance, but the terrifying prospect of eternal damnation. It was a constant psychological burden, a fear woven into the very fabric of your existence. The church offered a pathway to heaven, but it made sure you paid for the toll booth, often with your last penny. And this leads us to the grim reality that technology, that great driver of modern comfort and efficiency, was largely stagnant for centuries in the medieval peasant's world. Imagine living in an era where the tools your great-great-great-grandparents used were virtually identical to the ones you used and the ones your children would use. Innovation was incredibly slow, almost imperceptible. The heavy plough, a major advancement, had been around for ages, but it was still a cumbersome, animal-drawn beast. Hand tools like sickles, scythes, hoes and spades were largely unchanged. This wasn't just a lack of cool gadgets, it had profound, life-altering consequences. It meant that every task, from tilling the soil to grinding grain, was incredibly labour-intensive, time-consuming and inefficient. Yields from the land were low, barely enough to sustain the population, leaving little margin for error. A single season of bad weather, a pest infestation, or a blip in the always fragile ecosystem could, and often did, tip a community from subsistence to starvation. There was no scientific agriculture, no understanding of crop rotation beyond basic empirical knowledge, no fertilizers beyond manure. The world felt cyclical, unchanging, and utterly resistant to human improvement. This lack of progress wasn't just an inconvenience, it reinforced the feeling of being trapped, condemned to an unending cycle of identical arduous labor, generation after generation. The idea of things getting easier or better through human ingenuity simply wasn't a part of your worldview. This technological stagnation, combined with the crushing demands of the church and the ever-present threat of violence, created a psychological landscape of profound resignation. Why strive for more when more was almost immediately taken away, or when the tools simply didn't exist to make more possible? Hope, for a medieval peasant, was not about upward mobility or material advancement. It was about surviving the next winter, having enough food on the table, and securing a place in heaven. It was a life lived in stark contrast to our modern obsession with progress and innovation. Your life was defined not by what you could achieve, but by what you must endure. And endure they did, with a quiet, incredible stoicism that shaped not just their own lives, but the very foundations of the world that would eventually invent tractors and antibiotics. And that, my friends, is a reality that often gets lost in the romantic glow of medieval legends. But even with the church promising an afterlife of bliss, and the technological stagnation ensuring this life would remain a ceaseless grind, the psychological toll on a medieval peasant was immense, often beyond what our modern minds, accustomed to progress and individual agency, can truly grasp. Imagine a world where every decision, every action, was driven by a single overriding imperative: survival. This wasn't a choice, it was the default setting of your existence, stamped onto your soul from birth. The constant presence of death from disease, famine, violence, or accident meant that grief was a common, almost mundane companion, a dull ache that never truly left. You watched siblings, parents, and children succumb to ailments that today would be easily cured. This wasn't just sad, it was a deeply traumatizing reality that forced an emotional resilience, a kind of hardened acceptance, that would feel utterly alien to us. The sheer randomness of misfortune, from a sudden blight on the crops to a lord's arbitrary cruelty, fostered a worldview where fate was a powerful, unyielding force. An individual effort, while necessary, could easily be undone by forces beyond your control. This led to a profound sense of resignation, a quiet fatalism that seeped into every aspect of life. Why plan for tomorrow when tomorrow might bring plague, war, or simply no food? Why dream big when every ounce of surplus you created was instantly siphoned off by the Lord or the Church? This absence of upward mobility, coupled with the ever-present threat of utter destitution, created a specific kind of mental landscape. Hope, for a medieval peasant, was not about climbing the social ladder or achieving material wealth. Such notions were fantastical, the stuff of bards' tales. Instead, hope was small, focused, and intensely practical. Hope for a mild winter, hope for a good harvest, hope for your children to survive to adulthood, hope for a quick and painless death when your time came. Ambition, in the modern sense, was largely a foreign concept, often viewed with suspicion, as it could disrupt the delicate social order or incur the wrath of those above you. Your identity was not personal, a journey of self-discovery. It was communal, inherited, and tied directly to your village, your family, and your plot of land. Individuality was subservient to the collective, the survival of the unit paramount. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It fostered strong community bonds and mutual reliance, but it also suppressed personal expression and independent thought. The psychological burden of this collective identity, this endless struggle, and this profound lack of control meant that life was less about living and more about enduring, with moments of joy being precious rather than sustained states of being. Yet, even in this world of inescapable hardship and spiritual resignation, human ingenuity, however slow, found outlets, particularly in the realm of crafts and resourcefulness. For all the talk of stagnation, medieval peasants were masters of making do, of transforming raw, often meager, resources into the necessities of daily life. Your village wasn't just an agricultural hub, it was a small, bustling ecosystem of practical skills. You might not have been a knight, but you were almost certainly a part-time carpenter, a weaver, a rudimentary blacksmith, or a basket maker. The men were skilled at felling timber, shaping wood for ploughs and carts, repairing thatched roofs and crafting simple furniture. They could mend tools, construct fences, and even build entire huts from scratch using local materials. Women, beyond their relentless domestic and agricultural duties, were expert weavers, taking raw wool or flax and transforming it into thread, then into the coarse cloth for their families' clothes. They were skilled in dyeing with natural plant extracts, though the colours were often muted. They crafted baskets from reeds, spun yarn, made candles from animal fat, and prepared natural remedies from foraged herbs. Children, as we've noted, started learning these skills from a young age, an apprenticeship in self-sufficiency that ensured the survival of the community. This pervasive craftsmanship was not a hobby. It was an absolute necessity, driven by the complete absence of a readily available market for manufactured goods. Every item in your home, from your wooden spoon to your worn shoes, was either made by hand within the family or by a local specialist, often through barter. A cooper crafted barrels, a miller ground grain for a fee, and a blacksmith might forge a vital ploughshare. But even these specialists were often also peasants, working their own land, their craft, a secondary means of income or exchange. This deep reliance on self-sufficiency meant that skills were highly valued, passed down with meticulous care, and were critical components of your personal and communal resilience. Losing a skilled craftsman to disease or accident could have a devastating ripple effect, impacting the ability of the entire village to function. So, while life was physically brutal, it also demanded an incredible depth of practical knowledge and tireless manual dexterity, a quiet testament to the enduring human capacity to create and adapt, even when the world offered very little. Right then, we've navigated the external pressures, the Lord's heavy hand, the Church's inescapable grip, and the ever-present threat of a wolf having a bad day. Because even with the promise of eternal bliss from the Church, and the technological stagnation ensuring this life would remain a ceaseless, monotonous grind, the psychological toll on a medieval peasant was immense, often beyond what our modern minds, accustomed to progress, individual agency, and the comforting illusion of control, can truly grasp. Imagine a world where every single decision, every single action, was driven by a single overriding, visceral imperative: sheer, brute survival. This wasn't a choice you made on a good day, it was the default setting of your entire existence, stamped onto your soul from the moment you drew your first smoky breath. The constant, suffocating presence of death, from disease sweeping through a family like wildfire, from the slow, gnawing agony of famine, from random acts of violence, or from a simple, unpreventable accident, meant that grief was not a rare, shattering event. Grief was a common, almost mundane companion, a dull, aching throb that never truly left, a permanent resident in the back of your mind. You watch siblings, parents, friends, and most heartbreakingly, your own children, succumb to ailments that today would be easily cured with a trip to the local pharmacy. This wasn't just sad, it was a deeply traumatizing, numbing reality that forced an emotional resilience, a kind of hardened acceptance, a stoic fatalism that would feel utterly alien, perhaps even cold, to us. The sheer randomness of misfortune, from a sudden, inexplicable blight on the crops to a lord's arbitrary, brutal cruelty, fostered a worldview where fate was a powerful, unyielding force, a capricious deity whose whims could undo years of effort in an instant. Individual effort, while absolutely necessary, often felt like a desperate, futile struggle against forces far greater than yourself. This led to a profound sense of resignation, a quiet fatalism that seeped into every aspect of life. Why plan for tomorrow when tomorrow might bring plague, war, or simply no food at all? Why dream big, why strive for more, when every ounce of surplus you managed to wring from the land was instantly siphoned off by the Lord, the Church, or simply stolen by bandits? It was a psychological trap, constant reminder of your profound insignificance in the grand scheme of things. This absence of upward mobility, this unchangeable fate, coupled with the ever-present terrifying threat of utter destitution, created a specific, confined kind of mental landscape. Instead, hope was small, intensely focused, and relentlessly practical. Hope for a mild winter that wouldn't claim your last cow. Hope for a good harvest that would fill the granary just enough. Hope for your children to survive to adulthood and find a partner to share the toil. Hope for a quick and painless death when your time inevitably came. Ambition, in the modern sense, that burning desire for personal achievement and advancement, was largely a foreign concept, often viewed with suspicion, as it could disrupt the delicate, ordained social order, or worse, incur the wrath of those powerful few above you. Your identity was not personal, a journey of self-discovery or unique expression. It was communal, inherited, and tied directly, immovably, to your village, your family, and your small assigned plot of land. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It fostered incredibly strong community bonds and mutual reliance, a quiet understanding that we are all in this mud-soaked boat together. But it also suppressed personal expression, independent thought, and the kind of creative striving we often celebrate today. The psychological burden of this collective identity, this endless struggle, and this profound lack of personal control meant that life was less about living and more about enduring, with moments of joy being precious rather than sustained states of being. It's like living an entire lifetime on a hamster wheel, only the hamster wheel is made of mud and fear. And yet, even in this world of inescapable hardship, spiritual resignation, and mental confinement, human ingenuity, however slow and uncelebrated, found crucial outlets, particularly in the realm of crafts and sheer, desperate resourcefulness. For all the talk of technological stagnation, medieval peasants were not passive victims. They were absolute masters of making do, of transforming raw, often meager, resources into the very necessities of daily life with their bare hands. Your village wasn't just an agricultural hub, endlessly churning out grain. It was a small, bustling, self-sustaining ecosystem of practical skills, a tiny manufacturing plant where everything from a spoon to a shoe was made from scratch. You might not have been a knight, but you were almost certainly a part-time carpenter, a crude weaver, a rudimentary blacksmith, or a basket maker. The men, beyond their ceaseless agricultural duties, were skilled at felling timber with heavy axes, shaping wood for ploughs, repairing carts, and constructing the very frames of their wattle and daub huts. They could fashion simple furniture, mend tools that broke with alarming regularity, and build robust fences to keep out stray livestock and occasionally hungry wolves. They were the structural engineers, the handymen, the basic mechanics of their world. Women, beyond their relentless domestic duties and their demanding agricultural contributions, were the undisputed experts in textile production. They took raw wool, fleece shorn from their sheep, often scratchy and full of burrs or flax, and painstakingly cleaned, carded and spun it into thread using simple drop spindles or spinning wheels. Then, with a skill honed over generations, they wove this thread into the coarse, durable cloth needed for their families' clothes. They were skilled in dyeing with natural plant extracts, though the colours were often muted, earth tones, blues from woad, yellows from weld, browns from tree bark. They crafted essential items like baskets from reeds and rushes, coiled rope from plant fibres, made crude but functional candles from rendered animal fat, and prepared natural remedies from foraged herbs. Children, as we've noted, started learning these vital skills from a shockingly young age, an intensive, lifelong apprenticeship in self-sufficiency that ensured the survival of the entire community. This was not a world of specialists, it was a world of generalists, where everyone needed a diverse skill set just to get through the week. This pervasive, tireless craftsmanship was not a hobby, not a quaint pastime. It was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity, driven by the complete absence of a readily available market for manufactured goods. Every single item in your home, from your rough wooden spoon to your worn, patched shoes, was either made by hand within the family or acquired from a local specialist, often through barter rather than coin. A cooper crafted barrels, a miller ground your grain for a substantial fee, of course, and a blacksmith might forge a vital ploughshare or mend a broken tool. But even these village specialists were often also peasants themselves, working their own small plots of land, their craft a secondary specialised means of income or exchange within the tight-knit local economy. This deep reliance on self-sufficiency meant that practical skills were incredibly highly valued, passed down with meticulous care from elder to youth, and were critical components of your personal and communal resilience. So, while life was physically brutal and mentally confining, it also demanded an incredible depth of practical knowledge, tireless manual dexterity, and constant innovation within rigid limits, a quiet testament to the enduring human capacity to create, adapt, and make something out of very little. Even when the world offered very little in return, it's a reminder that true craftsmanship comes from necessity, not leisure. Right then, we've dodged the external boogeymen, the gnashing teeth of the wild, the crushing hand of the feudal lord, the omnipresent shadow of the church's demands. We've even taken a deep dive into the mind-numbing labour and the soul-crushing psychological toll of medieval existence. But believe it or not, even within the supposed sanctuary of your own muddy, smoky village, life was far from an idyllic communal dream. Tonight, we're peeling back the veneer of rustic charm and looking at another layer of the harsh reality, the messy, often brutal, scramble of village justice, petty disputes, and the internal conflicts that could make your neighbours as much a threat as any wool. Because when resources are scarce and tensions are high, even a misplaced chicken can spark a feud that lasts generations. So, before you imagine your quaint medieval village as a haven of peace and cooperation, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're brave enough to confront the unvarnished truth of human nature under extreme pressure. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn up the volume on that background hum of existential dread, and let's ease into tonight's truly uncomfortable journey together. Imagine, for a moment, the village as a pressure cooker. It's a tiny, insular world where everyone knows everyone else's business, their debts, their grudges, and exactly how many pigs they own. When a dispute arose, and oh they did, there was no formal police force to call, no slick lawyers, unless you were a rat apparently, and certainly no impartial county judge commuting in from the nearest big city. Justice, for the common peasant, was a far more informal, often arbitrary, and deeply personal affair. Minor squabbles might be mediated by the village elders, perhaps the most respected or feared old man or woman, whose word carried weight purely through reputation and the threat of social ostracization. The local priest might step in, offering spiritual counsel, threatening damnation, or simply trying to keep the peace for the sake of his own sanity. But ultimately, for many grievances, Justice was custom, tradition, and the uncomfortable reality that you had to live side by side with the person you were disputing with. Imagine trying to argue over a boundary stone that moved overnight, or a cow that strayed and ate your precious handful of turnips, knowing that the culprit lived 2 huts down. There was no easy escape, no way to simply unfriend your problematic neighbour. Every small slight festered, every minor injustice added to a growing ledger of resentment, because the stakes for everything were so incredibly high. We're not talking about arguments over who left the toilet seat up. We're talking about literal life or death squabbles. A fence, crudely constructed and poorly maintained, might be seen as deliberately shifted to encroach upon your tiny plot of land. A stray animal, a pig or a goat, might wander into a neighbour's field, trampling precious crops or devouring meager stored provisions, an act that, as we've seen, could lead to actual trials, but more often to bitter, unresolved tension. Theft, even of something as small as a handful of grain, a few eggs, or a length of homespun cloth, was a catastrophic event in a subsistence economy, and accusations could tear a community apart. And then there was the ever-present hum of gossip and reputation. In a world without written records for the common folk, your reputation was everything. A whispered accusation, a rumour spread by an envious neighbour, could ruin a family's standing, making them pariahs, cutting them off from vital communal support, or even leading to more serious accusations, especially regarding witchcraft. Because when you're all living on the edge, the smallest advantage, the slightest perceived slight, could feel like an existential threat, turning neighbour against neighbour in a desperate scramble for what little security existed. This tight-knit community pressure, while offering vital support in times of crisis, was a brutal double-edged sword. On one hand, collective labour was essential for survival, the strength of many hands to build a barn, harvest a field, or raise a roof. In times of famine or sickness, neighbours might offer a scrap of bread or a moment of comfort. But this interdependence also came with an incredible, suffocating weight of conformity and control. Deviation from established norms, even minor eccentricities, could be viewed with deep suspicion. If you were too successful, too lucky, or just a bit too odd, you might become the target of envy, fear, or even active malice. Ostracization wasn't just socially awkward, it could be a death sentence, cutting a family off from the very communal support needed to survive. Imagine being shunned, denied help in the fields, your children barred from playing, your goods refused in trade. This intense social policing ensured conformity, but it also meant that internal conflicts, once started, were incredibly hard to resolve, boiling under the surface and adding another layer of insidious stress to an already impossibly hard life. This leads us to a particularly chilling aspect of medieval village life: vulnerability to false accusation and the terrifying spectre of witchcraft. In a world utterly lacking scientific understanding, where every misfortune, a sick child, a cow going dry, a failed crop, a sudden death, could be attributed to unseen forces, fear and ignorance were ripe for exploitation. A disgruntled neighbour, a personal enemy, or even a frightened community seeking a scapegoat could easily turn against one of their own, especially if that person was a bit of an outcast, or perhaps an older woman living alone. Accusations of witchcraft were not uncommon, and they were terrifyingly serious. A trial for witchcraft, often overseen by an ecclesiastical court or a lord's representative, could lead to public humiliation, torture, and ultimately a gruesome death, usually by burning. Imagine the psychological terror of knowing that a bad harvest, a single cow's illness, or merely your neighbour's envy, could be enough to see you accused of consorting with the devil. There was little to no concept of innocent until proven guilty. In many of these cases, suspicion alone, especially when fueled by fear, could be enough to condemn you. It was a terrifying reminder that even in your own small village, among the people you had known your entire life, danger could emerge not from the wild, but from the dark, fearful corners of the human heart. So, while the external threats of the medieval world were undeniable and often overwhelming, the internal landscape of the peasant village offered its own unique brand of hardship. The lack of formal justice, the constant simmer of petty conflicts, the crushing weight of community pressure, and the terrifying vulnerability to false accusation all added layers of insidious stress to an already impossible existence. Even within their own, supposedly safe sanctuary, Life was fraught with internal tensions, suspicion, and the relentless struggle for fairness and survival against a world that often seemed designed to offer neither. And that, my friends, is a harsh reality that makes any modern-day neighborhood dispute seem like a walk in a very pleasant, air-conditioned park. Right then, we've dodged the wolf packs, cursed the relentless floods, navigated the petty squabbles of the village, and even grappled with the terrifying spectre of medieval witchcraft. We've established that medieval peasant life wasn't just hard, it was a multi-layered existential challenge. But even amidst these grand, sweeping terrors and the intimate, suffocating pressures of village life, there was one colossal, inescapable force that dictated everything: the relentless, suffocating economic trap of perpetual poverty and debt. Because when you're already living on the knife edge of subsistence, the smallest misstep, the slightest bad luck, could send you spiraling into an abyss from which there was no return. So, before you imagine any peasant ever pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, a concept as foreign as penicillin, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're brave enough to confront the unvarnished truth of a system designed to keep you firmly in your place. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to connect. Now, dim the lights, perhaps count your blessings and your savings account, and let's ease into tonight's truly disheartening journey together. Imagine for a moment a bad year. And in the Middle Ages, bad could mean anything from slightly less food to utter, complete, widespread famine. Your life, as a peasant, was an unending, precarious gamble against the elements. A late frost could decimate your young crops. Too much rain could rot the harvest in the fields. A prolonged drought could turn your precious grain, your family's very sustenance, into dust. A blight, a pest infestation, which, as we've seen, might get its own trial, could wipe out entire fields overnight. These weren't just agricultural inconveniences. They were life or death catastrophes that could plunge an entire family, an entire village, into the terrifying jaws of starvation. And when the harvest failed, you had virtually no safety net. No government subsidies, no crop insurance, no food banks. Your meager stores would run out, and the gnawing hunger would begin, first a discomfort, then an ache, then a crippling, desperate pain. This wasn't just physical suffering, it was a mental torment, watching your children weaken, knowing you couldn't provide. The concept of feast or famine was brutally literal, a constant, terrifying oscillation between barely enough and absolutely nothing. And when famine struck, or a personal disaster like the loss of your precious plough oxen occurred, you were forced into the inevitable, desperate embrace of debt. This wasn't debt as we know it today, with credit scores and repayment plans. This was often a deeply personal, inescapable burden. You might have to borrow grain from your lord, or a wealthier neighbour, or perhaps the local monastery. But such loans never came free. They were paid back with excruciatingly high interest, often in the form of more labour, more crops, or even a promise of future service. Imagine borrowing a sack of wheat, only to owe back 2 sacks, or 3, next harvest. This perpetual cycle of debt was almost impossible to escape. A bad year simply piled more debt onto existing obligations, creating a suffocating spiral downwards. You were essentially selling your future, and that of your children, for the immediate necessity of survival. This wasn't just a financial burden, it was a profound psychological weight, a constant reminder that you were always beholden, always struggling, always just one misfortune away from total ruin. Your economic life was less a journey, and more a hamster wheel made of mud and insurmountable interest rates. This financial bondage also meant a profound lack of opportunity and social mobility. As a serf, you were legally tied to the land. You couldn't simply pack up your metaphorical onion and your literal sack of anxiety and seek your fortune elsewhere. Leaving the land without your lord's permission was an act of rebellion, punishable by capture, severe beating, or even death. Even if you could somehow leave, where would you go? Your skills were agricultural, your knowledge local. The cities, if you managed to reach one, were often crowded, dangerous, and offered their own forms of poverty and exploitation. So, for generations, you and your family were destined to work the same land, under the same lord, battling the same unpredictable forces year after agonizing year. There was no concept of climbing the ladder, no education to unlock new possibilities, no investment to grow your wealth. The very idea of improving your station through individual effort was a fantasy. fundamentally incompatible with the feudal system. Your life was predestined, carved in the hard, unforgiving stone of medieval social structure, a constant crushing reminder that you were born into your role, and there you would likely die. This brings us to the harsh truth about the limited and dangerous outside world. For the vast majority of peasants, your village was your universe, your small, contained bubble of familiarity. Beyond its immediate fields and the edge of the nearest forest lay a realm of profound mystery and terrifying risk. Travel, for a peasant, was not a leisurely vacation, it was an extreme, often life-threatening undertaking. If you had to journey to a market town, or embark on a pilgrimage, one of the few acceptable reasons to leave your lord's land, you did so on foot, often barefoot, with minimal provisions, facing dangers at every turn. The roads were muddy, rutted, and infested with bandits who saw a lone traveller as an easy target. Wild animals, as we've discussed, were a real threat. Getting lost was common, with few clear signs or maps, and encountering people who spoke a different dialect could lead to misunderstanding or hostility. Sleeping outdoors, often in fields or barns, was the norm, adding cold, damp, and physical discomfort to your already exhausted state. This profound difficulty and danger of travel meant that your worldview was incredibly narrow, confined by the physical boundaries of your immediate surroundings. News of distant kingdoms, grand battles, or exotic cultures was rare, fragmented, and often filtered through gossip or the occasional, unreliable traveller. Your knowledge of the world was local, practical, and deeply rooted in the soil beneath your feet. This extreme isolation, coupled with the perpetual economic struggle and the threat of arbitrary violence, fostered an enduring, pervasive sense of futurelessness. It wasn't just about lacking hope for advancement, it was about a deeper, more fundamental absence of a predictable, controllable future. The constant anxiety of, will there be enough food next winter? Will plague strike? Will the Lord demand more? Will bandits burn my home? Was a relentless psychological burden. Planning beyond the next harvest was often a fool's errand. You lived, quite literally, day to day, season to season, in a cycle that felt eternal and unyielding. The linear progression of time, the idea of things steadily improving, was a modern construct. For the medieval peasant, time was cyclical, repetitive, defined by the turning of the seasons and the unceasing demands of the land. This fatalism, while a coping mechanism, also meant a profound lack of motivation to innovate or challenge the status quo, because why bother when the odds were so heavily stacked against you? Your future was not yours to shape, it was a coin toss, flipped by fate, nature, and the whims of powerful men. And that, my friends, is a harsh reality that makes our own anxieties about job security and retirement plans seem like the most luxurious of worries. Right then, my friends, we've walked through the endless fields of toil, shivered in those smoky, crowded huts, choked down the bland realities of pottage, and constantly looked over our shoulders for the grim reaper of medieval disease. We've navigated the crushing demands of feudal lords and the inescapable tides of the church, felt the psychological burden of a world devoid of progress, and even picked our way through the tense, rumour-filled battlegrounds of village disputes and the terrifying spectre of false accusations. We've faced down wolves, floods, and the spiritual dread of malevolent forces. We've explored the relentless economic trap of poverty and debt, and the profound, almost unimaginable isolation of a world with no wider horizon. Each segment has peeled back another layer of the harsh, unvarnished truth. Now, as our extensive, rather muddy journey through the annals of medieval peasant survival draws to its ultimate, concluding stretch, we must gather these threads of hardship, fear, and sheer, grinding endurance. We're here to synthesize this rich, often brutal tapestry, and to cast a final, contemplative gaze upon the enduring, if unromanticized, legacy of these anonymous millions. Because while the direct practice of putting a human being through this kind of life has mostly vanished, the underlying anxieties, ethical dilemmas, and philosophical questions that shape their existence still echo, albeit in radically transformed guises, illuminating the complexities of our own contemporary society. So, take a deep breath. Before we deliver our final, sobering verdict on medieval peasant life, consider giving a truly heartfelt like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you feel you've genuinely grasped the profound realities we've explored tonight. And, as always, let me know where you're tuning in from. It's astonishing to think of all the different contexts from which you're experiencing this history. Now, dim the lights one last time, Perhaps hold a moment of quiet reflection for the countless nameless souls who endured this existence, and let's ease into tonight's longest and perhaps most important journey together. We've explored a life where your body was quite literally your capital, constantly exploited, constantly aching. From the moment you drew breath in that drafty, smoke-filled hut, you were conscripted into an army of labour. Your hands, calloused and cracked, were the tools that fed your family, paid your dues, and literally built the world around you. There was no sick leave, no workers' compensation, no retirement plan. A broken bone, a debilitating illness, or the simple march of age didn't mean a comfortable rest. It meant a swift descent into utter dependence, a potential burden on a family already stretched to breaking point. Your diet was a monotonous, nutrient-deficient cycle of pottage and coarse bread, just enough to keep the engine of your body running, but never enough to truly thrive. Every meal was a reminder of scarcity, a constant negotiation with hunger. Your home, that cramped shared space with humans and livestock, offered little privacy and less comfort, a perpetual battle against damp, smoke, and pervasive parasites. Sanitation was a foreign concept, disease, a constant, invisible predator. Childbirth was a terrifying gamble, childhood a brief, dangerous apprenticeship in survival, and old age, a rare, often lonely, and increasingly burdensome existence. Your mental landscape was shaped by profound fear. Fear of famine, fear of sickness, fear of violence, and the deep, irrational fear of the supernatural that explained every inexplicable misfortune. This wasn't just physical hardship, it was a relentless psychological siege, fostering a fatalism and a deep, quiet resignation that would feel utterly alien to our modern, ambition-driven minds. Your existence was further constrained by a social structure as rigid and unyielding as the stone walls of your lord's distant castle. You were a serf, a property of the land, your life dictated by the whims of a powerful lord who extracted his due in labour, taxes, and absolute loyalty. The church, while offering spiritual solace, was another voracious master, demanding its tithes and enforcing its doctrines with the terrifying threat of eternal damnation. There was no social mobility, no individual journey of self-discovery. Your identity was communal, hereditary, and fixed. The dream of a better life was a dangerous fantasy, promptly extinguished by the brutal realities of a system designed to keep you firmly in your place, endlessly toiling for others. This was a life of profound disempowerment, where your voice was unheard, your complaints ignored, and your future not yours to command. And within the village itself, the close quarters, the intense scarcity, and the ever-present anxiety could turn neighbours into bitter enemies, with petty disputes escalating into devastating feuds, and the terrifying shadow of witchcraft accusations ever lingering over the unfortunate or the eccentric. Justice, when it came, was often arbitrary, biased, and deeply personal, offering little true recourse for the powerless. The economic reality was a perpetual trap. A single bad harvest, a single lost animal, could trigger a desperate spiral into debt, borrowing from the Lord or a wealthier neighbour at ruinous rates, essentially selling your future labour for immediate survival. This debt was a heavy chain, binding you and your children to the land, ensuring that any surplus you might miraculously generate would be immediately siphoned away. The lack of technological advancement meant that this cycle was unbroken, year after year, century after century. Your tools were ancient, your methods inefficient, your yields barely enough to sustain life. Innovation, in our modern sense, was virtually non-existent, reinforcing a worldview where time was cyclical, not progressive, and improvement, a distant, almost heretical notion. The outside world, beyond your small, familiar village, was a realm of profound danger and terrifying mystery, making travel a perilous, rare undertaking. This isolation meant a narrow worldview, knowledge confined to local lore and superstition, leaving communities vulnerable to fear and manipulation in the face of the inexplicable. It was a life lived day to day, season to season, without the comforting illusion of a predictable or controllable future. So, what can we, in our climate-controlled homes with running water, abundant food, and a doctor just a phone call away, take away from this profoundly uncomfortable history? Firstly, the medieval peasant serves as a stark, humbling counterpoint to our modern obsessions with comfort, convenience, and constant progress. They remind us, in the most visceral way possible, of the sheer fragility of human existence, and the incredible, often unappreciated luxuries that define our daily lives. That hot shower you just took? An unimaginable miracle. The ability to read this very text? A power once reserved for a tiny elite. Their lives were a relentless daily negotiation with scarcity, pain, and uncertainty, a constant battle that makes our first world problems seem almost laughably trivial. This isn't to dismiss our modern struggles, but to provide a profound sense of perspective, an invitation to acknowledge and appreciate the foundational ease that underpins our reality. Secondly, their endurance is a testament to the unyielding power of the human spirit. Despite conditions that would break most of us, they toiled, they loved, they created, and they found fleeting moments of joy in communal rituals, simple pleasures, and deep-seated faith. They built the agricultural base, sustained the populations, and maintained the social structures that would eventually evolve into our modern nations. Their anonymous, unromanticized suffering and resilience are the bedrock upon which our entire world is built. They are the unsung, utterly exhausted heroes of history, their quiet tenacity more profound than any knight's valor. Their lives demonstrate that humanity's deepest strength lies not in conquest or grand achievement, but in the sheer dogged will to simply carry on day after day, year after year, against overwhelming odds. Finally, the study of medieval peasant life challenges our romanticized notions of the past and encourages a critical examination of our own present. It forces us to confront the constructed nature of our social systems, our economic models, and even our definitions of justice and well-being. Are our own systems truly equitable? Are we, in our pursuit of comfort, losing some of the communal bonds and practical skills that once defined survival? What are the unseen taxes and feudal dues that we pay in our modern lives? By stripping away the glamour, the legends, and the comforting illusions, we reveal a fundamental truth, that human life, at its core, is a constant negotiation with our environment, our fellow humans, and our own limitations. The medieval peasant, for all their hardship, offers us a profound lens through which to examine what it means to be human, to struggle, to adapt, and to ultimately survive. Their harsh reality, far from being a distant curiosity, is a powerful, enduring echo, reminding us to never take the precious, hard-won comforts of our own existence for granted. And that, my friends, is a reality more astonishing and, frankly, more important than any dragon ever was.